So in this very beginning of my lighting tutorial, I'm going to talk about the color of light. And for sure, we all know color is probably one of the most significant actor to address the mood and everything else relating to a lighting design. So before we move to the exact content, I'd like to quickly show you guys the link. So I will also attach this link to the tutorial file, so when you read the introduction, you will know where to find it. So this is, I call a very boring reading test, because this reading list does quite boring, because we are talking about something really foundation and got to understand all of the notes. But if you decide to spend some time with me and watching this entire tutorial, and you may not have to try to decipher what is behind. So basically, those are the lists where I found my reference to support the theory I'm talking about in terms of lighting design foundation, and to be precise, in terms to the lighting color, or how we make the decision of the color choice while doing the lighting job. Right, so I'm gonna give you a quick glance about it, and now we're gonna jump into the reference file and we can start talking about the exact theory. So in the beginning, whenever we talk about a thing, there are several, I would say, practical actors we really have to consider, and that is the contrast and the general rules, like how you set up the contrast, because that's gonna affect the overall looking of your imaging regardless the topic. And the second part, I'm gonna quickly go through the difference of light source. So, and the third part in this tutorial, I will talk about more why Unreal is choosing the very color temperature 6500 as a default white balance. And later we're gonna talk about a few more practical examples of how to use the color palette. Right. So the very beginning of the contrast light ratio. So if any of your guys also graduate or trained in foundation of photography, you probably heard this very famous photographer Ansel Adams. So Adams has created almost practical and scientific zoom system, and simply this system was designed as a horizon chart, as we see here. And what it's doing exactly here is they talk about the intensity, the variation of black and white. So this is actually a screenshot from Adam's the zoom system. So in general, it's how he, as a photographer and as a profession, how to define the different scale of gray and white. So that comes back to whenever if you're using the camera, and if the camera has a built-in light emitter, and usually that light emitter is reading a neutral value regarding to the rest of the image. So which is why usually if we talk about the gray scale, or somebody we call them 18% gray or 50 gray, so that's a gray standard. And all of the rest of the contrast, they're actually defined based on the central gray or zone 5, we call them right here. So give a very practical example in Unreal. If I quickly search, switch into Unreal, and this is one of my current thing. So if I go to the eye adaptation exposure chart, if you're not sure where it is, I can quickly show you where. If we go to the editor preference, and then if we go to the keyboard shortcut, and usually I will suggest to people to set up the keyboard shortcut in the beginning, that is the HDR eye adaptation. So you can see here I am using this debug mode is HDR eye adaptation, and that is where I usually read my light meter. So long story short, you can consider this guy as a built-in light meter in your camera. And if you quickly see my post-process right here, and if I go exposure, well, you can tell now I have my certain exposure range between -1 to 0.5. That is the actual value, and you could rate this value right here. So if I'm moving around, since my exposure range has been locked, and here is like the default histogram will be -1 to 1. That means this chart exactly shows -1 to 1. So the current version I'm using is 5.1, and I believe the number is actually went back if you go with Unreal Engine 5.2, because I checked it myself. They fixed the UI. So in general, it's like this function will help you indicate how the exposure should get read, and read the exposure, lock them up. That will actually help you control the contrast level. And I will dive through how we rate the exposure precisely into the exposure chart. But now for here, I just want to quickly show you the relation between the adaptation, aka auto exposure setting up in Unreal Engine, and how we could use this photography-based lighting theory to define the exposure. So for example, I'm gonna give you the quick look. If I have two history min and max, if I define this guy and make him shorter, so be aware, like -1 is like in this left far end, and the 1 will be read as the right to this right far end. So for now, my length is -1 between 1. That means in the central should be 0. So if I get this guy into -2, and you will literally see this chart get expanded, because in the end, this green area is where we rate right here. So this green area indicates our min and max EV, and my current min EV is -1, and my max EV is 0.5. So regarding here is our -1 right here, and regarding here is our 0.5 right up here. And the total length, as I mentioned before, is indicated by this function. It's indicated by the histogram min and the max. So this will be the min, and this will be the max. So for now, I have shortened them because I literally only used this part of the value. And just to consider, this is the length of your light emitter, and this is the actual min and max EV you are regulated for your very thing. So that means those functions, they are actually the value where it's locked up your exposure, which controls how dark your thing could go and how bright it could go. And on top of that, we do have this little exposure compensation. So consider this guy as a multiplier. If I disable it, my thing could go a bit brighter, just because I do not have that 1.15 exposure compensation anymore. And a funny thing I found right here with Unreal is, unlike this traditional the zoom system we'll talk about here, because we still have the 50% or 80% gray you are defining right here, but to the left in traditional photography it's darker, but to the right, the traditional photography, they'll talk about somewhere highlight or even white. And because I have limited my exposure really narrow in Unreal, and also I think in Unreal it indicates in the other way, because for example, for now I am going beyond the 0, which is to the right, but Unreal will give me darkened result. See, if I switch back to 0, that means there's no exposure compensation. And then if I go to 0.15, and my thing is actually goes brighter. So just as a user experience, I kind of feel to the right side, Unreal actually indicates darkened result, so brighter result, and then actually if you go right, Unreal actually indicates the darkened result. So for example, you can see my original number here. I'm gonna show this to you guys again. So in the beginning is 0.15. So how about if I go -1? So it actually goes darker by value, but I can tell my little cursor, the little white cursor, it goes to the right. So which is why I'm saying by the chart, only by the chart, by looking, if this guy goes to the right way, it actually indicates darker result. And if this guy goes back to the left, it actually goes brighter result. So I can try to show this to you again. You see, so by number I'm going down, but this guy is actually going up. And if I go back like 1, and now this guy is going back to the left, but compared to the traditional zone system, which left is dark side, Unreal actually gives me a brightened result. So this is the only difference in terms of the indication of the chart. However, I hope this quick demonstration will make sense. But like I said, this is just one thing worth to mention, like you do have the tool in Unreal to regulate and control your brightness. That's where you could indicate the exactly exposure method from Adams or from the traditional photography. So this is one thing I think is worth to refer. But like I said, this is not the main purpose of this very tutorial. I'm gonna wrap up this little topic right now, and we could move to the next, which is the lighting color. Right. So in general, lighting-wise, regardless you are working with 3D or nature light source like as photography or studios, we simply define the light source into two types, that is nature light source and artificial light source. So whenever we talk about nature light source, in general, you could think about anything related to exterior lighting. For example, suns, stars, or moon, but for sure, technically speaking, moon is actually a reflector. So that's why I do not list the moon as part of the nature light source. It's not really used for exterior lighting. It's just like technically speaking, to be precise, and the moon reflects the sunlight, and that's like down to the earth, everybody knows it. And here is a quick concept and indication for color temperature, and I believe that's not a strange term to many of us who has played around with Unreal. So whenever if you operate any light source, such as if I jump back to this guy and turn off my exposure, whenever I'm searching a light source, and if I type, because I can see the light diffuse color here, and I can also see the temperature right here. So this is the very function where control with color temperature. And long story short, you could consider color temperature is just like a different measurement for the light color. So usually it goes up to like a higher number, and that means it's gonna go cooler. And this is just like quick indication, because we can tell like, well, a focus or like 10 o'clock or even like lunchtime, usually the sunlight will go cooler. And also like in the magic hours, they have lower color temperature, which judged by Kelvin, and that is where you could indicate the light color in a more scientific term. And the next unit difference, I want to talk a bit more about luminate candela and candela per square meter. So that is the surface brightness of lighting. One thing really confused myself in the beginning whenever I'm studying Unreal is I never understand why under skylight in the beginning they always call them intensity scale instead of intensity. So later I've learned from like other professional lighters as well. So I've been told this is actually like an average intensity of the skylight brightness. And here is a quick screenshot from Wikipedia. We'll talk about the relationship between candela per square meter and a nit. So a practical example, guys, I could directly refer is if you go to any Apple store and you check their screen and like their monitors, and they're gonna tell you what is the maximum nit, and that means basically that's define how bright the screen could be. And well, personally, I don't recommend using any overbrighted screen just because that's not good for our eyes. But in general, you could consider this is more like a life experience term to talk about different units which using for the lighting measurement. I have a really good reference page to share with you guys. So I found this page right alongside while I'm drafting this reading list of this very tutorial. So in general, I would say give it a read, because like I said, I am an artist myself. I don't really like study physics, or like I don't really have like sound knowledge about all of the optical stuff. However, I do think like reading a little bit of the index and explanation, so to help us understand understanding how to use our tool correctly as a user, it's actually very helpful. Just like the Apple Monitor example I give you guys, because I literally just found that myself, and I start to like slowly get them understand, because no matter we're using Neat, Candela, or like Candela per square meter, that is kind of really abstract term. And if you do refer more about the tech terms and read a little bit more reference, I think that would be way more helpful to us in general. While I'm talking about this tool, it's more or less like I assume you are just like myself. I'm using it as a tool, but I'm not a scientific person. I'm not an engineer, so I think this will be way easier for us to understand this term. So here is a quick screenshot of this Unreal UI, and I just want to give you guys a live example about why, like in here now we kind of understand the intensity scale is a scale. It's never talk about the exact lighting intensity, because skylight itself is actually rated by the area, so that's like it's an equal value hit when the light hit a certain area, instead of judging by the luminance or illuminance. So luminance and illuminance, long story short, is as is described. So luminance is more or less about the bouncing back light, where we're judging by lumen. So lumen was measured with reflective light, and nits or candela, anything like such, they are actually measure the direct light. So as it said right here, luminance is a description, is amount of light falling onto the illuminated and given surface area. So take this list and give them a second rate, and hopefully you could understand. So long story short, when we talk about lumen, we will actually talk about the reflective light coming from the surface power. And when a light hit a surface, and what happens right there is like, depending on the characteristic of the surface, the surface will either reflect back fully, almost fully, or it's gonna happen, some of the decay gonna happen. So that's how we start saying the light will bouncing back with different result. Right. So talk about the artificial light. For sure, like in nature light source, we tend to use Kelvin to describe the warm and coldness. It's not like you are not allowed or it's forbidden to add extra color while set up the lighting thing. But my personal recommendation for any, like if you start a light thing and if you are working with the exterior lighting source, in general I'd say keep the color quite neutral. For sure skylight is blue, and at some point you could get that blue by capture the sky atmosphere if you do have a blue sky. Because don't forget, whenever we talk about the skylight in Unreal, you could basically consider it as a giant secondary field light source, and it affects everywhere. And even you're not giving the skylight color itself right here, you could, depending on your surrounding, because skylight color to me as an artist point of view, I basically read them as environment color. It's like whenever we're painting, if we have a couple of steel objects placed on a blue table, and we could somehow catch it some blue light bounce around like each intersections or like in between those objects. So I think that's like, again, it's a very live experience term. So hopefully this will help you understand how we use the skylight and why the skylight comes with intensity scale in more like, you know, human experience term rather than reading those long tech references. Well, at least to me, this term is way easier to understand. Then finally, come back to the artificial light source. So there are two types of primary color in the color theory, and I believe that's very well known. So, well, if you ever go to printed anything, and people will usually say if you transfer an image and getting ready to print, Photoshop will ask you to transfer or save it either in RGB or CMYK color scheme. So I would say the CMYK color format, it's basically for printing. And also here we also call it the way how CMYK is mixed, it's subjective color. So it's a bit more abstract term if I explain them purely tech-wise, But more or less you could think about in such a simple way. For example, you have a bunch of pigment, and mixing different color of the pigment definitely is gonna result the color gonna start get dirty and stuff gonna get dark. If you mix every different pigment together, in the end you probably get the really dark or black or like weird looking dark color pigment. So that is a fact of subjective color mix. However, in lighting, simple knowledge, if you have multiple lights, so light the room with 3 different color lights, for sure you provide more lighting power to a certain fixed size space. And in the end, is even you lighted the room with several different color because there's too much light and the power gets adding up. So in the end, the result could be bright yellow or even white, because each light adds the power, color, and the brightness on top of each other. So that's my simple human understanding of additive color mix. So here is just like 2 very basic terms. And depending on different media, for example, you are using pigment, for sure that is subjective. And if you are using lighting, in most of the case, that is additive color mix for sure. But different primary color also shows huge influence to the result. A very clear term, guys, I want to emphasize here is under CMYK or any like printed color, subjective color model, pigment, CMYK, the primary color, as well known, will be red, yellow, cyan, or somebody we just call them red, yellow, blue. However, in lighting, yellow is a mixed result of red light and green light, so which is why our primary color in lighting or RGB format is red, green, and blue. The reason I want to emphasize this is later in the later section when we enter in the color theory and color palette, this will make better sense to help yourself understand or why like I have to keep my warm light key light as yellow, but I could create some of the green or jade tone, and why I do need a couple of blue light, but I have to be really careful whenever we control the brightness and saturation, because lighting is a physical form. So if you want to see more saturate like the color of the light, definitely we have to keep the brightness low, because that is how the physical value remains together or conversions. So that's one thing I'd like to emphasize before we even move further.